The scream cut through the marble halls of the Riverside County Superior Court like a blade through silk. It was not the controlled objection of a seasoned attorney, nor the emotional outburst of a grieving family member. It was raw, primal terror that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and sent pigeons scattering from the windows 3 stories above. "Oh my God, they're killing her!" The voice belonged to Margaret Chen, a court reporter with 23 years of experience who had witnessed everything from murder trials to custody battles. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her stenotype machine clattered to the floor as she rose from her seat, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the front of courtroom 9A. The woman in the black judicial robe lay convulsing on the polished marble floor, her body jerking as 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through her nervous system. The yellow wires of the taser connected her to Officer Derek Paulson, whose face had gone pale beneath his buzz cut as he realized something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. 37 minutes earlier, Judge Camille Price had pushed through the heavy oak doors of the courthouse, her heels clicking against the marble with the measured cadence of someone who had walked these halls for over a decade. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had earned her respect from colleagues and the nickname the Iron Lady from court clerks, who had watched her handle the most contentious cases with unwavering composure. The morning air still held the crisp bite of October, and Judge Price paused to adjust her black wool coat as she surveyed the scene before her. Media vans lined the street like sleeping beasts, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky. Protesters had already begun gathering behind the police barriers, their signs reading, "Stop HOA Tyranny" and "Justice for Homeowners" in bold, angry letters. Today was the day she would preside over Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association versus Chen, Morrison, and Patel, a case that had drawn national attention after allegations surfaced that the HOA board had systematically targeted minority homeowners with frivolous fines, illegal property seizures, and harassment campaigns designed to force them from their homes. Judge Price had spent the weekend reviewing the mountain of evidence, photographs of beautiful homes with microscopic violations, documentation of selective enforcement, recorded phone calls where board members used racial slurs when they thought no one was listening. The plaintiff families had lost their homes, their savings, their sense of security. Today, she would ensure they received justice. As she approached the courthouse steps, Judge Price noticed the unusual security presence. Instead of the familiar faces of the court's regular bailiffs, she saw officers from Riverside Meadows Security, a private firm contracted by the HOA. Their uniforms were crisp black with gold badges that caught the early morning light, and their demeanor was aggressive in a way that made seasoned court personnel uncomfortable. Officer Derek Paulson stood at 6 feet 4 inches, his frame filling out his security uniform in a way that suggested he spent more time in the gym than studying constitutional law. His partner, Officer Maria Santos, was smaller, but no less intimidating, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of someone looking for trouble. "Morning, Your Honor," called out James Mitchell, the court clerk who had worked with Judge Price for 8 years. He hurried down the steps, his face creased with concern. "I tried calling your chambers, but you'd already left. There's been a development in the Riverside Meadows case." "What kind of development?" Judge Price asked, though she continued walking toward the entrance. She had learned long ago that last-minute dramatics were often attempts to delay proceedings, and she had no intention of postponing this trial. The HOA's attorneys filed an emergency motion this morning, claiming security threats. They've brought in their own officers and are requesting additional delays. Mitchell's voice dropped to a whisper. "Judge, these guys aren't like our regular bailiffs. They're asking questions about who's allowed in the courtroom, demanding to see identification from everyone. even the court staff. Judge Price paused at the courthouse entrance, her hand resting on the brass handle. Through the glass doors, she could see the officers Mitchell had mentioned. They stood with their arms crossed, blocking access to the elevators. Their presence transformed the usually welcoming courthouse lobby into something that felt more like a military checkpoint. "Have you contacted Sheriff Rodriguez about this?" she asked, referring to the county sheriff who oversaw courthouse security. "I tried, but he's in Sacramento for a conference. His deputy said the HOA had proper authorization for additional security due to the high-profile nature of the case." Mitchell's frustration was evident in his voice. "Judge, I've been working in this courthouse since 1998, and I've never seen anything like this." Judge Price straightened her shoulders and adjusted her coat. "Then, it's time they learned how we do things here." She pushed through the doors with the confidence of someone who had faced down unruly defendants, hostile attorneys, and political pressure without ever backing down. The lobby fell silent as she entered. The private security officers turned toward her, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Officer Paulson stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. Court personnel only." His tone was polite, but firm, the kind of voice that expected immediate compliance. Judge Price continued walking toward the elevators, her judicial identification badge clearly visible on her coat. "I am court personnel. Officer Judge Camille Price, presiding over the Riverside Meadows case this morning." Officer Santos stepped beside her partner, effectively blocking Judge Price's path. "We're going to need to see some identification, ma'am, and we'll need to search any bags or personal items before you proceed." The request was so unprecedented that Judge Price actually stopped walking. In 12 years on the bench, no security officer had ever asked to search her personal belongings. Court security knew every judge by sight, and the idea of subjecting a member of the judiciary to the same screening as a courthouse visitor was not just irregular, it was insulting. "Officer Santos, is it?" Judge Price read the name tag on the woman's uniform. "I appreciate your dedication to security, but I don't require screening. I'm sure you understand the protocols for judicial personnel." Officer Paulson moved closer, his 6'4" frame towering over Judge Price's 5'6" stature. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we don't know you. We have our orders, and everyone gets screened. No exceptions." The tension in the lobby was palpable. Court employees who had arrived early for the high-profile trial watched from the sidelines, their expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Margaret Chen, the court reporter, whispered to another clerk, "They can't be serious. That's Judge Price. She's been here longer than most of the building." Judge Price remained calm, but those who knew her well could see the subtle signs of her growing irritation, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her fingers pressed against her briefcase handle. She had dealt with plenty of power-hungry court officers over the years, but none had ever challenged her authority so directly. "Officers, I'm going to proceed to my chambers now," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in courtrooms across 3 counties. "The trial begins at 9 o'clock, and I have preparation to complete." She stepped to the right, intending to walk around the officers, but Paulson moved to block her path again, his hand resting on his taser, and his voice carried a new edge of aggression. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. You need to comply with our security protocols, or you'll need to leave the building." The lobby had gone completely silent. Even the usual morning sounds of the courthouse, the hum of conversations, the clicking of heels on marble, the ding of elevator bells seemed to have paused in anticipation of what would happen next. Judge Price looked directly into Officer Paulson's eyes, her voice dropping to the tone she reserved for the most serious moments in her courtroom. "Officer, I am Judge Camille Price, and I am ordering you to step aside so I can proceed to my chambers. This is not a request." Officer Santos laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Lady, I don't care if you're the Queen of England. You're not going anywhere until you submit to screening." That was the moment everything changed. Judge Price had faced down drug dealers who threatened her family, gang members who tried to intimidate her with violent gestures, and corrupt officials who attempted to buy her silence. But she had never encountered law enforcement officers who refused to acknowledge her judicial authority. She decided to take a different approach, pulling out her cell phone to call the sheriff's department directly. But as she raised the device, Officer Paulson's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "No unauthorized communications in the security zone," he said, his grip tightening around her wrist with enough force to leave marks. Judge Price jerked her arm back, her professional composure finally cracking. "Officer, you are assaulting a sitting judge. Remove your hands from me immediately, or I will have you arrested for contempt of court and assault on a judicial officer." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Every person in the lobby knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. But Officer Paulson, instead of backing down, seemed to interpret Judge Price's resistance as a challenge to his authority. "That's it," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for trespassing, failure to comply with lawful orders, and resisting security personnel." Judge Price backed away, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Officer, you cannot arrest a judge for attempting to enter her own courtroom. This is beyond irregular. This is criminal." But Paulson was already moving forward, Santos flanking him on the left. To anyone watching, it looked like two officers apprehending a disorderly courthouse visitor. Judge Price's judicial identification was hidden beneath her coat, and her black attire could easily be mistaken for the kind of formal dress that protesters often wore to make a statement. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Santos commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that most people didn't question. Judge Price instead turned toward the courthouse employees, who were watching in stunned silence. "James," she called to the clerk who had greeted her earlier, "call the sheriff's department immediately. Tell them Judge Price is being unlawfully detained by private security." But before Mitchell could respond, Officer Paulson had closed the distance between them. His hands grabbed Judge Price's shoulders, spinning her around with enough force to send her stumbling backward toward the marble wall. "Stop resisting," he shouted, though Judge Price had done nothing more than try to maintain her balance. The command was loud enough to be heard throughout the lobby, and it served its purpose, establishing a narrative that would justify whatever came next. Judge Price steadied herself against the wall, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. These officers weren't just overstepping their authority, they were operating in a reality where her judicial position held no meaning. "Officers, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her judicial authority. "I am Judge Camille Price, appointed to the Riverside County Superior Court in 2011. I am scheduled to preside over the Riverside Meadows HOA case in 37 minutes. If you continue this unlawful detention, you will be held in contempt of court, and I will personally ensure that criminal charges are filed." Officer Santos pulled out her taser, the yellow device catching the fluorescent lights of the lobby. "Ma'am, you're obviously having some kind of mental health episode. No one's going to believe you're a judge, dressed like some kind of activist and causing trouble in a courthouse." The comment hit Judge Price like a physical blow. The implication was clear: a black woman couldn't possibly be a judge. And any claim to judicial authority was evidence of mental instability rather than a statement of fact. Margaret Chen, the court reporter, couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "Officers, that really is Judge Price. I've worked with her for years. She's presiding over the HOA case this morning. Please, just check her identification." Officer Paulson turned his attention to Chen, his face flushing with anger. "Ma'am, step back. You're interfering with a security situation, and if you don't back off, you'll be arrested too." But Chen's intervention had given other courthouse employees the courage to speak up. James Mitchell stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had worked in the courthouse for over 2 decades. "Officers, Margaret is right. That's Judge Camille Price. She's been assigned to this case for months. If you would just allow her to show her judicial identification, this whole situation can be resolved." Officer Santos raised her taser, pointing it in Mitchell's direction. "Everyone needs to back off right now, or someone's going to get hurt. We have a situation here, and we're going to handle it according to our protocols." Judge Price realized that the situation was escalating beyond anything she could control through normal channels. These officers were operating under some kind of directive that superseded normal courthouse protocol, and they were prepared to use force to maintain their authority. She decided to try one more time to de-escalate the situation. Slowly, she reached into her coat to retrieve her judicial identification badge, the one that would instantly verify her position and authority. "Officers, I'm going to show you my judicial identification. It will confirm everything I've told you, and we can all move past this misunderstanding." But as her hand moved toward her interior coat pocket, Officer Paulson shouted, "She's going for a weapon!" Time seemed to slow down in the way it does during moments of crisis. Judge Price saw Officer Santos raise her taser, saw the red targeting dot appear on her chest, saw the finger begin to squeeze the trigger. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, to use the voice that had commanded respect in courtrooms across the county. The taser fired with a sharp popping sound that echoed off the marble walls like a gunshot. The probes struck Judge Price in the chest and abdomen, and 50,000 volts of electricity crashed through her nervous system like a lightning strike. Her body convulsed, every muscle contracting simultaneously as the electrical current overrode her ability to control her own movements. She fell backward, her head striking the marble floor with a sickening crack that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it. The judicial identification badge she had been reaching for fell from her coat pocket, skittering across the marble floor like a metallic butterfly. It came to rest near Margaret Chen's feet, its gold lettering clearly visible: "The Honorable Camille Price, Chief Judge, Riverside County Superior Court." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that appears in the moment before a natural disaster, when the world seems to hold its breath before everything changes forever. Margaret Chen was the first to break the silence, her voice rising to a scream that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. "Oh my God! They tasered Judge Price! They tasered the judge!" Officer Paulson looked down at the badge near his feet, and his face went white as he began to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Officer Santos was still holding the taser, the wires extending from the device to the convulsing woman on the floor, her finger frozen on the trigger, as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. James Mitchell was already running toward the security desk, shouting into his radio, "Emergency in the main lobby. Judge Price has been tasered. We need paramedics immediately." But even as the chaos erupted around them, Judge Price's body continued to convulse on the cold marble floor, the electrical current turning her into a prisoner within her own nervous system. The black judicial robe that had been a symbol of her authority was now torn and twisted around her legs, and blood began to pool beneath her head where it had struck the floor. Officer Santos finally released the taser trigger. But the damage was done. Judge Price lay motionless, except for the occasional twitch that indicated her nervous system was still trying to recover from the electrical assault. The courthouse lobby, which had been filled with the quiet efficiency of morning preparations just minutes before, was now a scene of barely controlled chaos. Court employees rushed to Judge Price's aid, while others called for emergency medical assistance. The private security officers stood frozen, their faces showing the dawning realization that they had just committed an act that would destroy their careers and possibly land them in federal prison. Margaret Chen knelt beside Judge Price, her court reporter training taking over as she checked for vital signs. She's breathing, but barely. Her pulse is erratic. She looked up at Officer Paulson with an expression of pure rage. "How could you do this? How could you taser a judge?" Officer Paulson's voice cracked as he responded. "We didn't know. She didn't show identification. She was acting suspicious, refusing to comply with security protocols." Suspicious. James Mitchell's voice carried across the lobby as he returned from calling for emergency assistance. Judge Price has been coming to this courthouse every day for over a decade. She's presided over some of the most important cases in county history. And you thought she was suspicious. Officer Santos finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. She matched the description we were given. African-American female. Approximately 5'6", wearing dark clothing, attempting to disrupt courthouse operations. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and everyone in the lobby understood the implications. The HOA's security team had been given a description that could have applied to any number of people. But they had chosen to see Judge Price as a threat, rather than as the judicial officer she was. As if summoned by the gravity of the situation, the courthouse's main elevator doors opened, and Chief Deputy Sheriff Maria Gonzalez stepped out. She had been in the building reviewing security protocols for the high-profile trial when the emergency call came through her radio. Chief Deputy Gonzalez took one look at the scene, Judge Price unconscious on the floor, the private security officers standing over her with weapons drawn, the courthouse employees in various states of shock and outrage, and immediately took control of the situation. "Officers, holster your weapons immediately," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years in law enforcement. "Step away from Judge Price and place your hands where I can see them." Officer Paulson started to protest. "Chief Deputy, we were just following our protocols. This woman was acting suspicious and refused to cooperate with security screening." Chief Deputy Gonzalez's expression could have frozen water. "Officer, you just tasered a sitting judge in her own courthouse. There are no protocols that justify that action. You are both under arrest for assault on a judicial officer, and I strongly recommend you remain silent until you can speak with an attorney." The sound of sirens began to echo through the courthouse as paramedics and additional law enforcement arrived on scene. But even as the lobby filled with emergency personnel, all eyes remained focused on Judge Price, who was beginning to show signs of regaining consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, as her nervous system continued to recover from the electrical assault. Margaret Chen squeezed her hand gently, whispering, "Judge Price, it's Margaret. You're in the courthouse. Help is here." Judge Price tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "What? What happened?" "You were tasered, Your Honor," James Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. "The HOA's security officers didn't recognize you, and they tasered you." As Judge Price's awareness returned, so did her memory of the events leading up to the assault. She remembered the officers' refusal to acknowledge her authority, their aggressive demands for identification, the way they had treated her like a criminal rather than a member of the judiciary. But she also remembered something else. The Riverside Meadows case was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. And there were families waiting for justice. Families who had lost their homes to the same organization that had just authorized an assault on a sitting judge. The paramedics arrived and began their assessment, checking Judge Price's vital signs and examining the head wound she had sustained when she fell. One of them, a veteran EMT named Robert Hayes, knelt beside her and spoke in the calm, professional tone that emergency personnel use to reassure patients. "Judge Price, I'm Robert with County EMS. You've sustained a head injury and electrical shock from a taser. We need to transport you to the hospital for evaluation and treatment." Judge Price struggled to sit up, her voice growing stronger as her nervous system continued to recover. "No. The trial is scheduled to begin in 18 minutes. There are families waiting for justice, and I will not allow this assault to delay their case." Robert Hayes exchanged glances with his partner, clearly concerned about Judge Price's condition. "Your Honor, you've sustained a significant head injury. You need immediate medical attention." But Judge Price was already trying to stand, supported by Margaret Chen and James Mitchell. Her legs were unsteady, and her head throbbed with each heartbeat. But her resolve was unwavering. "I'll receive medical attention after I've fulfilled my judicial obligations," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the most respected judges in the county. "Mr. Mitchell, is Courtroom 9A ready for proceedings?" Mitchell nodded, though his expression showed deep concern for Judge Price's condition. "Yes, Your Honor, but perhaps we should consider a continuance given the circumstances." "Absolutely not." Judge Price adjusted her torn judicial robe and picked up her briefcase, which had been knocked across the floor during the assault. "The plaintiffs in this case have already had their lives disrupted by the actions of this HOA. I will not allow my assault to cause them additional delays." Chief Deputy Gonzalez approached Judge Price with obvious concern. "Your Honor, with all due respect, you've just been assaulted. These officers are under arrest, but you should really consider seeking medical attention before proceeding with court business." Judge Price looked directly into Chief Deputy Gonzalez's eyes, and everyone present could see the fire that had made her legendary in legal circles. "Chief Deputy, I appreciate your concern, but I have a job to do. I will hold court this morning, and justice will be served." She began walking toward the elevators, each step more steady than the last, as her nervous system continued to recover from the electrical assault. Margaret Chen and James Mitchell flanked her, ready to provide support if needed, while the paramedics followed with their equipment, clearly unhappy about their patient's refusal to seek immediate medical care. As they reached the elevator, Judge Price turned back to look at Officers Paulson and Santos, who were being placed in handcuffs by additional deputies who had arrived on scene. Her voice carried across the lobby with crystal clarity. "Officers, you will be held in contempt of court for your assault on a judicial officer. But more importantly, you will answer for your actions in the very courtroom where you attempted to prevent justice from being served." The elevator doors closed, but everyone in the lobby could feel the weight of what had just happened. The HOA's private security team had not only assaulted a sitting judge, but they had done so in an attempt to prevent a trial that would expose their organization's systematic discrimination and abuse of power. As the elevator rose toward the 9th floor, Judge Price closed her eyes and took deep, controlled breaths. Her head still throbbed, and her body ached from the electrical assault. But her mind was crystal clear. She had a job to do, and nothing, not assault, not intimidation, not the systematic abuse of power would prevent her from ensuring that justice was served. The elevator stopped at the 9th floor, and the doors opened to reveal Courtroom 9A, where the Riverside Meadows case was scheduled to begin. through the courtroom's windows. Judge Price could see that the media had caught wind of what had happened in the lobby. News vans were arriving. Reporters were setting up their equipment. And the story of the judge who was tasered by HOA security was already beginning to spread. But inside the courtroom, the families who had lost their homes to the HOA's discriminatory practices were waiting. They had been waiting for justice for months, and Judge Price was determined to ensure they received it, regardless of the personal cost. As she entered the courtroom, still supported by Margaret Chen and James Mitchell, every person present rose to their feet. The gesture was automatic, a sign of respect for the judicial office. But it was also something more, a recognition of the courage it took to continue serving justice even after being assaulted for attempting to do so. Judge Price took her place at the bench, her judicial robe torn, but her authority intact. She looked out at the packed courtroom, the plaintiff families, the defense attorneys, the media representatives, and the observers who had come to witness what everyone knew would be a landmark case. She picked up her gavel, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her hand. With a voice that carried the full authority of the law, she called the court to order. Good morning. This court is now in session. The Honorable Camille Price presiding. We are here today in the matter of Chen Morrison and Patel versus Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the courtroom like a declaration of war against injustice. Judge Price had been assaulted, bloodied, and humiliated, but she had not been defeated. And as the trial began, everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, a judge who had literally been attacked for attempting to serve justice, yet refused to allow that attack to prevent her from doing exactly that. The Riverside Meadows case would proceed. Justice would be served. And the HOA that had authorized the assault on a sitting judge would face the full consequences of their actions. Judge Price had ensured that much, and her courage in the face of unprecedented assault would be remembered long after the verdicts were read and the sentences handed down. In the weeks that followed, Officer Paulson and Officer Santos would be convicted of assault on a judicial officer and sentenced to federal prison. The Riverside Meadows HOA would be ordered to pay record punitive damages to the families they had discriminated against, and their board members would face criminal charges for their role in authorizing the assault. But more importantly, Courtroom 9A would be renamed the Justice Camille Price Hall, a permanent reminder that justice cannot be stopped by assault, intimidation, or the abuse of power. It can only be delayed. And sometimes, even that delay makes the eventual victory all the sweeter. Judge Price continued to serve on the bench for many years after that October morning, and she never forgot the lesson she learned in the courthouse lobby, that justice is not just about the law, but about the courage to uphold it, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice. The families who had lost their homes got them back. The discriminatory HOA practices were permanently ended, and a new standard was set for how the justice system responds to attacks on its own officers. The scream that had echoed through the courthouse lobby that morning had been one of terror and outrage. But the sound that followed, the steady, authoritative voice of Judge Camille Price calling her court to order, was the sound of justice refusing to be silenced, no matter the cost.